All right, welcome everybody. I want to start by acknowledging all First Australians, acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Bryce Wakefield and I am the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Well, it's been an interesting week in Australian foreign policy, which is why I'm glad we have the chance to update ourselves by delving into history and remembering the principles that have guided successive Australian governments with the new edition of this book, Fear of Abandonment. If I can just read the opening paragraph of the book, which is not by the author, but by the preeminent diplomat and historian of his time, George Kennan. If we plod along with only the feeble lantern of our vision of contemporary events, unaided by history, we see, to be sure, a little of the past just under our feet. But the shadows are grotesque and misleading. The darkness closes in again behind us as we move along, and none can be sure of direction or of pace, or of the trueness of action. And what Kennan is obviously saying here with more poetry than I can muster is that for a fully informed policy, we have to have an understanding of what has gone before us. So we're very lucky not only to have this book, the old edition, covering how Australian foreign policy from 1942 to 2016 has shaped alliances with more powerful allies, relations with Australia's neighbours and Australia's place in the international order. We also have an updated version covering the years since, but we're most lucky, of course, to have with us today its author, Allan Gyngell. Hi, Allan.
Hi, Bryce.
So I'll keep Allan's bio short. Allan is, of course, a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, but also its national president. He is an officer of the Order of Australia and an honorary professor at the Australian National University. He was the Director General of the Office of National Assessments and founding executive director of the Lowy Institute. You can hear his views regularly on Australian foreign policy on the Australia in the World podcast, which he co-hosts with Darren Lim and which is supported by this institute. Now, Allan is going to give us an introduction to the new edition of his book. And before moving into the Q&A, we'll be joined in discussion with our dear friend, Professor Caitlin Byrne, who is the director of the Griffith Asia Institute and who is also a fellow of the AIIA. Hello, Caitlin.
Hi there, Bryce.
All right, before we get things started, just a reminder that for those of you out there in Zoom land, you can input your comments anytime into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you see a comment you like, you can click on the thumbs up logo to upvote it, and questions with the most upvotes will float to the top of the pack where we will choose to ask them or not. And while you're on your keyboards, it would be remiss of me not to ask you to also use them to procure yourself a copy of the updated version of the book, if you have not done so already. It's available on the Black Ink website. That's Black Ink with an INC, blackinkbooks.com.au. There you can get the update as an ebook, or you can pre-order a paperback copy. The link is in the description for this program where you will have registered, and I'll also post it in the comments. And if you're watching this delayed on YouTube, I will link to it up here. And so with the introductions and the plug for the book out of the way, I'll now turn things over to Allan. Allan, take it away, please.
Thanks very much, Bryce. And I do appreciate the plug because it turns out that global pandemics are not a fantastic time to be launching books. So it's really great that so many of you could join in this webinar, and I thank you and I thank Caitlin and Bryce for making it possible. I thought before we got on to the current edition, I'd just give you a bit of backstory. I originally wrote this book because after what had then been a 45-year career working on issues that I thought were important and in jobs I loved, I wanted to put into some sort of context. There's a sort of psychological need to work out, what this has all been about. By training, I'm a historian, and there hadn't been a narrative history of Australian foreign policy written for 40 years. So I thought it was important to tell that story in an accessible way. But I also wanted to reassert the value of foreign policy. Australians tend to see our past heroically and through a military prism. So if you were to go out onto the streets and ask passers-by what Australia had done in the world, I'm pretty sure that you'd be answered with a litany of battles and wars. Gallipoli, Western Front, Kokoda, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and so on. The shelves of our bookshops are full of military histories, and those are certainly worth stories worth telling. But foreign policy sits uncomfortably with our national image. It gives accounts of lengthy negotiations and backroom deals in distant conference centres. And whatever the value of the output, the means of making it is hardly the stuff of national myth or to get the pulse racing. And I can still remember the look of despair on my publisher's face when I first pitched to him the title for this book, A Short History of Australian Foreign Policy. But in fact, the world Australia inhabits, one where we have a close alliance with the United States, where Japan is no longer an enemy, but a close partner, where our trade takes place in a global framework of rules and regulations. That's one that's been shaped by foreign policy. So I spent 3 years writing the book, and it was published in 2017, concluding with the Australian elections of 2016. Its takeoff point was 1942. Now, there's a debate among historians about where Australian foreign policy began, and we certainly did a lot in the world before 1942. The contribution we made to the First World War is evidence of that. But the unarguable place at which Australian foreign policy began was when the Australian Parliament said it did, by putting beyond doubt any question of our sovereign identity in the world by ratifying the Statute of Westminster in 1942. And that was British legislation which provided unarguable autonomy to the dominions of the Crown. After the war was over, we established a professional foreign service, of course, and within 10 years, you could see the pattern of the three strands that would thereafter shape the foreign policies of all Australian governments. First, relations with a great and powerful friend, especially the negotiation of the ANZUS Agreement by Percy Spender 70 years ago, of course. Secondly, engagement with the region around us in an effort to shape it in ways conducive to our interests. And that began with the decision to recognise the emerging Indonesian independence movement, especially by Ben Chifley. And finally, support for a rules-based order in which Australia could play a part. And we saw that especially, of course, in H.B. Evatt's role at the formation of the United Nations. My argument in the book is that all three of those strands, not just the commitment to the alliance, but the others as well, are responses to the deepest strategic anxiety in Australia, which is our fear of abandonment. Our worry about how a small group of people located far from the places from which all of us, except original Australians who've been here for 60,000 years, had come, how we could sustain an audacious claim to a continent. I also wanted to write the book because I I realized that having joined what was then the Department of External Affairs in 1969, I was going to be among the last of a generation of people with links back to the actual creation of an Australian foreign service and foreign policy. I had memories and in some cases personal contact with some of the key figures who'd been around from the start, politicians like Paul Hasluck or officials like Jim Plimsoll or Keith Waller and Arthur Tang. So that was the book. Then in the middle of last year, my publishers, La Trobe University Press, contacted me and said that they wanted to reprint the book. So I pulled it down from the bookshelf and looked at it again. And I realized, I think for the first time, just what a different world 2016 had been. The final two paragraphs of the history read, "The election campaign came and went without any sign that foreign policy was much on the minds of voters or their representatives. But at the political margins, increasingly insistent, the sounds could be heard of more fundamental disagreements about the liberal international order and the globalised world which it had delivered." Now, since then, of course, those sounds have risen to a mighty crescendo, and we've seen Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, Xi Jinping's new assertiveness in China, rampant populism, plus the greatest global pandemic in a century. So I said to Chris Feik, I really think I need to update this. And to be honest, I also had reason myself to want to work out what the hell had just happened. So that brings us to this final chapter, which begins with the aftermath of the 2016 elections in Australia and ends with the inauguration of President Biden in January this year. I called the chapter Sovereign Borders, thank you, Scott Morrison, because that so neatly encapsulates the trends of these 4 years, a response to both geostrategic change and the pandemic disease, which has led to decoupling, deglobalization, and a breakdown of the international system really into its smaller and smaller constituent parts. The international order that Australia had prospered under since the Second World War is over. And during those 4 years, you can trace in the comments of Australian politicians the slow shift from assurance that everything was okay to the acceptance that fundamentals had indeed changed. For me, the principal cause of those changing fundamentals was that the positions of the two most powerful states in the world, the US and China, both of them ceased to be status quo powers. The US judged that it was no longer getting the return on the investment which it wanted, that it had put into the international order it had established, and China wanted the order to conform better to its own growing power. So the chapter traces Australia's responses to these changes through the cementing of the Indo-Pacific as a framing device for Australian foreign policy, the walking on eggshells management of the relationship with President Trump, the deterioration of relations with China on so many different fronts, the end of military engagement in the Middle East and its consequences, the impact of Brexit, climate change, of course, and finally the arrival of the COVID pandemic. No event in my lifetime, I think, has had such a profound effect on the world as the appearance of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in early 2020. I said when we had Helen Clark on a webinar recently, I think you have to go back to the experience of global war that finds something that matches in its totalizing impact the experience all around the world of the pandemic. It's had implications for global health, for domestic and international economics, politics, ways of living and working, for international equity, gender relations, even thought patterns. All of those things have had universal and significant impact. Borders have been shut, even state borders in Australia, which I don't know about you, but I had never imagined was even possible. And globalisation has been slammed into reverse. Now, foreign policy doesn't have an end point, and days after the book was republished, Australia's world changed again with the announcement of AUKUS and nuclear submarines. So there's a lot to talk about, and I won't go on about this now. But because this is a book relaunch, I do have to express my thanks to several people, to my publisher from La Trobe University Press, Chris Feek, my editor, Kirsty Innes-Wills, my friends Rick Smith and Derek Abbott, who were my first readers, Mitchell McIntosh, who gave me superb research assistance, and finally, of course, Catherine Gingel. I promised her my retirement, and I've delivered nothing like it, and she has put up with it with the patience, mostly with the patience, and always with the insight of a partner of more than 55 years. So I thank her, and I thank all of you. Thank you, Bryce.
Thanks very much, Allan. It's great to see so many of the people you mentioned in the rather substantial audience. And we are getting questions already, and I'd encourage you to, again, write those questions into the Q&A and upvote them if upvote any questions you like. Now, you mentioned towards the end of your talk the new agreement, or promise of an agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. And I think that's kind of the elephant in the room. You've been quite vocal about that. So let's get it out of the way immediately before we bring Caitlin in. Can we have your views on AUKUS, please, Allan?
You can, Bryce. And my views have sort of wavered, gone up and down from the first shock of the announcement, as I was sort of sitting there at 7 o'clock in the morning or something, listening to the news onwards. I think this is a potentially very important development, but I do think that it has to be broken down into its constituent parts, because it's not entirely clear what AUKUS is. You can sort of look at it in two different frames, if you like. At one level, it's simply, as I understand it anyway, an agreement between three countries, US, UK, and Australia, on the exchange of sensitive technology, together with a decision that over an 18-month-long period, there will be an investigation into whether we have the legal, the workforce and other requirements necessary to build nuclear submarines here in Australia as a replacement for the French attack class submarines, which have now been ended. So that's the sort of minimal view. On the other side of it, though, you've got the this is the most exciting and important development in geostrategic geostrategy in the Indo-Pacific since the Second World War. This is a forever partnership which is going to be completely transformative. So my own view at this stage is that it's not quite as important and game-changing as the first announcements suggested. I worry about certain dimensions of it. I think that presentationally, it did get portrayed as Australia's return to the Anglosphere, reinforced by Boris Johnson talking about our kindred down in Australia. I think there are real questions about the purpose of the submarines and whether they are going to serve the strategic ends that we hope they will in 30 years' time. And there are very big questions about cost. This is almost certain to add at least an extra 1% of GDP to our expenditure on defence, and that at a time when Australia is going to be under pressure from the borrowing that's been necessary to handle COVID, and the likely shift in the contribution that China has made over recent years to Australian prosperity.
Great, Allan. You've written on. I mean, you came out fairly strongly pretty early on this with the notion that this locks us into the Anglosphere, and you've just mentioned that presentationally it does so. But are you? I mean, you seem to be sort of shifting ground on that. Are you sort of taking a wait and see approach now, or as to how tight we are coming together with the United States and the UK, or
the United States dimension of it doesn't sort of worry me at all. I mean, we're a long-standing ally of the United States. We've had important technological discussions with them before. Most of our high-end equipment comes from the United States. That doesn't bother me. I think the addition of the UK, again in presentation, I mean, really, as I said before, this seems to be simply a tripartite agreement between three governments on the mutual exchange of information about high tech, and there's lots of that about. That's not a global treaty. So I'm not sure what the purpose of having the UK in it was from our perspective. From the UK perspective, I think it was a wonderful opportunity for Boris Johnson to show that global Britain was back and once again a world power. But I don't think it actually delivers that. So on autonomy, my main concern would be with the use of the nuclear submarines, because we will. I haven't heard anyone who suggests that we'll be able to operate those alone. It's true that other important parts of the Australian Defence Force, we're heavily dependent on the US, but I think this would take it to a new level. But these are all questions which I think have to be argued about and discussed over the coming 18 months.
Okay, very good. I'll ask Caitlin to come in now. Caitlin, can you continue the conversation, please?
Thanks so much, Bryce. And thank you, Allan. It's really a great pleasure to be joining you for the launch of this book, joining you from Brisbane, outside the bubble of the nation's capital. I'm here on the traditional lands of the Turrbal and the Jagera peoples. And, I did want to say very firstly, congratulations. I have the first edition behind me. I have the second edition on my iPhone. So it comes in all formats for all of those in the audience. And you know what I think this, what a time to be launching this book. I know, pandemic notwithstanding, your timing has really been impeccable, given the events of this week. This concept of a fear of abandonment has really never been more compelling in some respects. I should also say it's September. We've got a couple of months before Christmas. This will be on lists in households around the country. So I'm sure that many people will be enjoying this read over the break, a much needed break, I suspect, that we'll all be having. But look, I just wanted to say a couple of words, I guess, on the book, if you don't mind, Allan or Bryce. The first edition, as you mentioned, Allan, was published in 2017, and it's really organised around various chapters that seem to fall quite neatly into decades or even groups of decades early on. It finishes, as you mentioned, that with the time frame of 2008 to 2016, themed around this idea of a fragmenting world, which for me really reflected a sentiment at the time, an emerging view and a deep uneasiness about the change underway, but a sense that we couldn't quite grasp what that change really meant, what the implications of that might be, particularly for Australia. And you only have to go back to the 2009 and 2013 Defence White Papers to get also a similar sense. The world is changing, tectonic changes are underway, but we're not quite sure where it's leading, and there are some very big question marks still hanging over that scenario. And this is exactly where your new edition picks up, with the aptly titled final chapter, Sovereign Borders, although I did wonder whether you had toyed with the idea of Fortress Australia even. Now, in this chapter, I think you resolve some of those question marks, and you do give us a fairly sobering view of what the world looks like, of the process of strategic reordering that is underway. And I think you ask us questions. I think there are some challenges contained within the book. And we need to really ask ourselves just how well equipped is Australia placed to navigate the complexities that this reordering actually brings. Unsurprisingly, I think this is not a theoretical text, and you've already mentioned, your rich kind of engagement with these issues as a practitioner over a significant amount of time. But it is a text that's not nostalgic in its view, and you really do delve deeply into the intersection between history and practice in Australia's experience of foreign policy making. Recognising very early on that the world is a messy place, I think you seek to hold a lantern to the many threads that come together through the process of foreign policy making, the threads of history, of memory, of geography, of culture. And for me, at least, I think you offer some broad reassurances, in part about foreign policy making itself. And for some, this may not be quite so reassuring as it is to me, but I quote, you talk about foreign policy as the unceasing cycle of action and reaction in response to an inconceivably complex set of variables, end quote. So there's no end game here. We have to be skilled in the process, the iterations, the interactions that foreign policy brings. I also wanted to mention the fact that this is a text about identity, and I think that's, for Australia, again, a particularly compelling read for us. You make the comment very early on, and you've already mentioned this, that in this book, or in the way that Australians think about their engagement in the world, the stories of wars and battle really loom large. There is a mythology around this, but these really aren't the stories that interest you. Rather, your intent is to cast light on the neglected and much quieter chronicle of statecraft and diplomacy. And I think by doing so, bring value to what diplomacy is all about as an operating system for foreign policy. And you speak to the way that Australians and their governments have thought about and have acted and have pursued their place in the world. The fact also that we are a journeying people comes through. All of these, I think, are really important in the way not only that we think about the world, but actually how we think about ourselves. So to this end, what I love about this book, and what I think many in the audience will want to speak more about, is that you bring the personality and the politics, the agencies and the decisions in some of the many dynamics, the many interactions that have shaped the contours of our foreign policy making in this country since 1942. You bring these to life. Much of this draws on an exceptional account of the historical record, but of course, you are the storyteller. And so it does reflect your very unique experience as someone who has been deeply immersed in the dynamics and the decision-making, working closely, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes in a more public sphere, to really shape the way Australia approaches its region and the relationships that it holds dear within the region. So I did want to say, Allan, it really is important for us to recognise the breadth of content that you bring together in this book. You do it with a clarity of thought that I think is exceptional, with a generosity of spirit, particularly intellectual spirit, and with a unique humility that I think is brand Allan, that helps to bring us along in the debates, and it's not just in this book. I think we see this also in the Australia in the World podcast. The fact that we can engage in debates. We don't necessarily come down on the same side of the argument. AUKUS is a great case in point. But for me, certainly as someone who has spent some time as a practitioner in this space, there is something to be gleaned about this messy business of foreign policy making and the very significant role that it plays for Australia and should continue to play for Australia in the way that we approach the world. Now, you've already talked to us a little bit about your thoughts on AUKUS, but I wanted actually to bring you back to a central issue of diplomacy, and particularly given the fact that you set out these very consequential events that have marked the last 5 years of the world's development. And as you've been looking at many of these issues, you are very concerned with where we are investing and how we are developing our skills in persuasion, in shaping the multilateral order, in engaging with advocacy and coalition building. You do make mention of the fact that given through the developments over the last 5 years, the government in many ways doesn't seem to place a great deal of value in the professional skills of diplomats or in diplomacy itself. So I wondered if, just to kick off, you might sort of speak to this breadth or the breadth of developments, but how do you make sense of where diplomacy fits in this Australian experience?
Well, look, thank you, Caitlin. I'm really overcome. You weren't invited onto this webinar to say nice things about me. You were invited to give us your views, but that was really enormously generous of you, and I do thank you very much for it. I agree with the interpretation that you just gave. The parallel with Australia's fixation on our military history is the view that the answer to the questions, the issues that we face in the world is going to be a defence and military one, and we've seen that absolutely in the last weeks with the debate about nuclear submarines. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I believe in a strong defence force. I see precisely the reasons for both deterrence and warfighting, that defence is an important part of statecraft. But the other bit of statecraft, that is foreign policy, the bit in which you manage the relations between the component parts of the system in ways that advance your interests and protect your values, I think has been squeezed out. in recent years. So the response to what's been going on in China, for example, has been framed almost overwhelmingly, not almost entirely, overwhelmingly in national security terms, whereas I think, although I have no particular disagreement with the policies that Australia has adopted, things like the ban on Huawei, or belief that we need strong foreign interference legislation. No problems with that. But I think diplomacy was marginalised in the way in which we did that. I think that there was, I think that successive governments have been guilty of mixed messaging, of using a broadsword, whereas stiletto would have been more important and more useful, and not themselves having a clear view of what the outcome that they wanted was. Now, none of this is to suggest that China's diplomacy hasn't been also greatly at fault. It just amuses me that Beijing thinks that some of warrior diplomacy are a sensible and effective way of getting what you want in the world. I think that the creation of coalitions of opponents should have taught that lesson by now, but I can't do anything about Beijing. I can comment more on Australia, and I think in Australia, diplomacy and the role of foreign affairs has been squeezed out. There've been a lot of insider, this is the way it happened, stories about how AUKUS came into being. In none of them have I seen references to the crucial role of consultations with DFAT and or even the foreign minister. I'm sure she knew, but was obviously not an important element in which people had the opportunity to think through all the consequences and the way in which it would be announced and described.
I was on mute. COVID hasn't helped with any of that, and Francis Adamson describes the pandemic, and you make note of this in the book, as the most disruptive and multifaceted crisis we've experienced. And yet at the same time, we've had our diplomatic network stretched more thinly on the ground possibly than we've seen before, and refocused certainly onto consular issues. Not to say they're not important, but how do we operate in this virtual world?
That's a really interesting question, and something that is ripe for work of the sort that you do, Caitlin. I think it's a great topic. How has the pandemic changed diplomacy? I've got a pretty strong sense that if we hadn't been in the middle of this pandemic, we wouldn't, particularly in the relationship with China, be in quite the position we are, because there would have been over those 2 years many more opportunities for ministers, Chinese and Australian ministers, to bump into one another deliberately or accidentally at international meetings. And although Zoom, as we're seeing now, is a wonderful technology, and God knows how we would have got through this without it and its counterparts. but it's entirely different experience to that of meeting in person, and particularly at the level of political leadership, being able to read the nuances and the pauses and the hints that you can get speaking one-on-one, rather than, as is always the case with Zoom, lots and lots of people in the call. So the Australia-China relationship is obviously not the only way in which that's happened. So in some ways it's been positive. People have found that it's much easier actually to be able to get in touch with your counterpart in the Indonesian foreign ministry and just have a chat once a fortnight or something. You don't have to get on a plane and go. So that's good, and that's going to stay. But at the top levels, I think it's had destructive implications.
Mm. And China, of course, looms large, in this relationship. We haven't had a prime ministerial visit to China for a number of years, probably since the beginning of the final chapter, actually. And even with the latest round of visits, we're not seeing Australia come close to having any contact with China. So, how do we break through in this relationship? Not only do we have a lack of diplomatic engagement, we have no Australian media on the ground. So our understanding of what's happening in the landscape is similarly poor.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. And again, not entirely our own fault. There are reasons why we don't have correspondence in China at the moment, but I think it's a huge absence for us because there are fewer. We've still got our embassy there, and I'm no doubt. Well, their capacity to work is, I think more limited because of the reluctance of the Chinese to talk to us. But for the public, for the general public, it's there's no sort of way of sort of getting more sort of richer descriptions of what's going on in China, and that sort of contributes to the othering of China that we're seeing at the moment. It's every time you turn, there's a news report on television, you get either missiles or squads of PLA infantrymen goose-stepping their way across Red Square, rather than our correspondent there talking to people in the public. So, as I said, not our fault, but again, another thing which is contributing to the poverty of the discourse between Australia and China at the moment.
And I know there's, when you first launched this book and you spoke with Paul Keating, Paul Keating made the point that great states need strategic power, and if you don't give it to them, they will take it anyway. How true of this is China? We're seeing developments in relation to Hong Kong. We're seeing developments in Xinjiang. How true is this statement today of China, and how do we handle that?
Sorry, this is how true is Keating's statement?
So Paul Keating made the statement that great states need strategic power, and if you don't give it to them, take it away, take it anyway.
Yes,
I'm seeing China do that.
Strategic space. I think I'm not because I'm a foreign policy person. I believe that there are myriad opportunities for to change the direction of the developments in the world. So Darren Lim, very a good friend, and I debate on this on the podcast often. I was saying in the one that we released this week that foreign policy for me is like biology and international relations, and you could say strategic policy as well as like physics. I'm down the biology end of things. I think the jungle is teeming with all sorts of things that are growing, and some things can be encouraged, and some can't, and some you have to hack down. And but slowly you can work your way through the jungle. There's no doubt that China has become more powerful. That with its growing power, it has developed its own military and capabilities. That its objective is to make sure that the United States can't control any areas inside, the immediate what's called the first island chain and the second island chain. My own view is that these are essentially defensive. It's an offensive sort of defence, but I don't think it's preparatory to sort of launching down through Southeast Asia to attack Australia or anything like that.
Well, just bringing things closer to home, AUKUS has certainly dominated the news. It's consumed a lot of the commentary, and I guess one of the issues is it has shone a light on how well we know the reactions coming out of our own region, coming out of Southeast Asia, and also out of the Pacific. And you do speak in your book to the Pacific Step Up. Do you think that, are we able to actually cover the breadth of our closer region? And I am thinking about, with the Pacific Step Up, have we actually dropped the ball in Southeast Asia? Or are we able to manage the many complexities of the diplomatic relationships in this region? What's your take on this, particularly in light of AUKUS?
Yeah, I think we had dropped the ball in Southeast Asia. Nothing to do with AUKUS. It was partly to do, I think, with the incredible pressures that were being applied to the Australian aid budget. At the time, the emergence of COVID, which meant it all had to be redirected, and the Prime Minister's interest in and knowledge of the South Pacific. So the South Pacific, became the focus of the government's foreign policy. Southeast Asia, I think, got a bit marginalised in the discourse. And Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia is difficult work. If you are an Australian foreign policy maker, then Southeast Asia is really hard going because it's a complex mix of different states, all with their own independent relationships and histories and cultures and so on, all with different views of Australia. And you need resources to put into that, human resources, and you need financial resources, and you need physical resources. And I don't think that we had done that to the extent we needed to. The language was fine. We believe in ASEAN centrality gets trotted out at every opportunity, but that's not enough. And it's not enough either, I think, to leave it to the sort of diplomats on the ground. You need engagement at the political level too, and that's another thing that has been so difficult during COVID, and another possible impact of that is that the Prime Minister wasn't able to get around and see and meet to all the people that he might have.
And at different points, I think just to draw that out a little more, at different points in the book, you make the point that the main challenge Australia faces is one of imagination and creative skill, particularly now where it seems the narrative and the vision of ourselves in the world has been quite shaken. And you do finish the book with a question for the nation's political leadership, and you ask, can our political leaders bridge the perpetual and necessary tension between a tragic imagination that contemplates catastrophe and an inspired imagination that envisions a better world? In other words, can we shake our deep-seated fear of abandonment? I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on whether we can, and maybe what advice you have for the next generation of political and foreign policy leaders and diplomats who are going to be faced with the need for imagination and creative skill.
Yeah, look, the events of the past 2 weeks have been great for my book, I think, in triumphantly vindicating the title of it. So it's another clear reminder that that fear of the future lies deeply in us. But I do think that we are going to need a breakthrough. I do think, I don't know, you disagree with me on AUKUS. You said before, and I'd be really interested to hear the points of disagreement on that. But one of the problems for me is just the symbolic one of shifting Australia back into that sort of Anglo-sphere world in the imagination of plenty of Southeast Asians and others who still think that we've never ventured very far from that. But look, Australia itself is so enormously different from what it was 75 years ago. We have yet to see, I think, the working through in Australian foreign policy of the views of the generations of people from India and China and Malaysia and Singapore and Latin America and the Middle East and from Africa in all this. So there's a sort of dynamic down there which needs to be utilised. I don't mean just in the way that it's often referred to for sort of building links, people-to-people links with those countries. I mean, it's in reconceptualising the way in which Australia ought to operate in the world. Now, there are limits to that. There's geography is a really big limit. We are where we are, and some of the issues are always going to be there. But I think there are different ways which are going to come out of another generation of engaging with the countries around us.
I think I actually sit far more closely to your position on AUKUS. The strategic capability that nuclear-powered submarines brings quite aside, what worries me is that the language harks back to a misplaced nostalgia for the Anglosphere. And I would agree with you that in some ways that rhetoric is stifling our imagination of how we find our place in a much more complex and much more diverse region. And I think that is something that the next generation of young leaders will have to grapple with. And they'll have to grapple with it at a time when we're investing less and less in the study of the region, in our university systems, but also just more generally thinking about where we sit in the region and how we understand it and how we deeply understand it. So I think there are some real challenges ahead that we are going to have to bridge, and I'm not quite sure how we do that. One of the things I would say is that the AAAA, and I know your own experience probably sits well with this, offers an opportunity to engage people in debate. And I think that, quite aside from the capabilities that we're going to, that young people will require in terms of knowledge of the region, technological skills, is the capacity to debate and to think through and weigh up the costs and benefits of these many interactions and how we respond to key developments. I don't know that we instill that skill all that well.
Yeah. Look, that was a wonderful ad, and I was actually going to say something a bit like that, because the AAAA is unique in being a community-based organisation. So think tank is not a university. It comes out of the community, and as you alluded to, Caitlin, my first experience of grown-up conversations about the world was as a high school kid coming along to at the suggestion of my history teacher to meetings in Melbourne. So yeah, people should sign up, and Bryce will always be there to point you in the right direction.
Indeed, and I know the questions have been really flying through, so I'm going to hand back to Bryce to pick up on the audience questions. Allan, as always, it's just a pleasure to speak with you. Again, congratulations, and look forward to many more conversations around the book.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Yes, indeed, and thank you for the plug, Caitlin. Here we are. We're at internationalaffairs.org.au. You'll find our events there. Hopefully, one day when we can all meet each other in person, I'll see you face to face when you join a branch of the AAIA. We're all over the country. Now we were kind of coming to an end there on AUKUS. I mean, I think we're going to be talking, we'll be talking about AUKUS all day if I ask all of the AUKUS questions, but I do want to stick with it just for the time being, because there is a question here about, I mean, you've talked, Allan, about I don't want to say negligence, but the neglect that we've shown perhaps to our neighbours, our understanding of Southeast Asia, and there are a number of questions about what AUKUS means for Australia's relations with its neighbours. I'm going to read one from somebody who I think I know who he is. He's put his name down as Wilson. Does AUKUS give rise to fear of abandonment among smaller players in the region? In other words, are their voices going to be drowned out, whether it be New Zealand, smaller Southeast Asian partners, or Pacific Island countries? Australia seems to have done exactly what it fears great powers would do, that is, acquiring greater military capabilities than in most cases even the great powers, if we're talking about the number of nuclear-powered submarines or nuclear-propelled submarines acquired by Australia will outnumber what UK and France has. And there's a number of questions about ASEAN and New Zealand, which take on the same sort of position. So could I ask you to be a little bit more reflective, particularly in the context of AUKUS, about those relations, Allan?
Yeah, look, Bryce, I don't think that AUKUS itself necessarily means that at all. As I said before, at one level, AUKUS is nothing more than a three-way technology sharing intergovernmental agreement between the three countries. I know it was sold as I said before, the sort of forever partnerships and major, strategic shift, but I don't think there's any necessary reason why AUKUS should impact on the relationships that we have in Southeast Asia and with New Zealand. New Zealand, I think, will be a slightly different, in a slightly different position, because New Zealand has had, what it's regarded, and what I regard certainly, as a special relationship with Australia, and I can see a feeling in New Zealand that this is a sort of a turning of cold shoulder to Wellington. Could be, that will depend on how Australian governments deal with it. The other dimension from Southeast Asian point of view is, if we do, and as I said before, this is a hell of a long time frame we're dealing with, unless we lease submarines from or get American or British submarines stationed here earlier. But one way or the other, it's going to be a long time. But if you're Indonesia, or you are Vietnam or Thailand, you do have to think about the military capabilities which your neighbours have. And although we might say and mean, look, these have got nothing to do with you, we're not directing them against you, as strategic friends say, it's capabilities that matter, because intentions can change quickly. So I think it will have an impact on the way Australia is seen in those areas. That we be in those countries, rather. There'll be a bit more concern about where the future might take things.
Good. There's another, actually a Pacific nation, which we haven't mentioned too much at the moment, that Ian Parmenter is asking about. He says that, or he asks that our relationship with France, and to some degree the European Union, is collateral damage in the nuclear submarine agreement and AUKUS. Could we have managed France better in the lead up to the sub's AUKUS announcement? And what can diplomacy do to repair that relationship?
In the end, if the decision was going to be taken to dump the French submarines, and I've got no, insight whatever into, into what the problems were, or whether we needed to do it, there was certainly no easy way out on that. But the recentness of the Prime Minister and other ministers talking to their French counterparts and giving no sign that they were about to spring this surprise, certainly I think could have been handled better. You'd have to know the exact details to work out how. But there's no doubt that the French feel not just disappointed and not just embarrassed, but also insulted. And when that happens at the level of President and Foreign Minister and so on, the consequences can be long drawn out. I think that's a pity, because I do believe that one of the most interesting innovations of the Morrison government in foreign policy was the emergence of the formal India, France, Australia trilateral meetings. I thought that was a very interesting way of building up the network of minilateral arrangements in the region. France is a much more sort of significant player in both the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean than the UK is, and so we're going to pay a price for the way in which we've handled handled this diplomatically. Can diplomats work their way out of it? Well, they will be trying very hard to do that, and eventually, the world will change. As I said, it sort of things move on, but I would be surprised if it was not something which stuck in the memory for a long time.
Okay, because there's so many of them, I'll do one more AUKUS question and then I'll turn over to Caitlin to see if she has a question. But Colin Hasseltine says, AUKUS signals to China more clearly than ever before, and will be thus seen in Beijing, that Australia, an Asia-Pacific country, has become an adversary of China and has joined with major powers outside the region to operationalize this position. This is a significant strategic shift and will not be undone unless either country changes direction. This will have consequences. Could you comment on those observations? What are the consequences and how do we deal with them?
It's a question from someone who knows China much better than I do, I fully agree with him. I mean, in one of the clear results of the announcement was that it put beyond any ambiguity Australia's commitment to a point of contestation, if not more, with China. The only the role of the submarines is so very clearly to be part of an integrated Western, if you like, capacity to challenge China. That's of course the way it will be. It will be taken in Beijing. I don't see any easy way out of it. I think that's a problem for us more than it's a problem for China. China has larger problems than Australia in all of this, but for Australia, the consequences for us of breaking of this sort of adversarial relationship with China are going to be more real. It is interesting, or it is instructive that at the moment President Biden can speak directly to Xi Jinping and to President Macron, and the Australian Prime Minister is unable to do both. Australia is always going to be at the bottom of this pecking order.
So, Allan, I might change tack a little bit and just pick up on another of the questions that's come through. This is from Elaine, and she asks, following responses to COVID, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Pacific Step Up, issues in trade and many other international events, how do you see Australia's foreign policy being shaped by the electorate or determined through the next election, and perhaps influenced by the many Australians who reside and or are stuck overseas, if at all?
Well, I think this issue of what impact the general public has on foreign policy is a perennial one and an interesting one. And for most of Australia's history, honestly, the answer has been not much. And I think not much just here, but I think not much even in comparison with other countries about our size. You can look to Canada, for example, on this, and I think that Canada's foreign policy has been much more shaped by groups and immigrants inside Canada than Australia's has been. Is this going to change? No sign yet. I mean, as you were saying before, the creation of an informed public was one of the reasons for the whole establishment of the AAAA. So, we have a desire to see more of that. COVID has had the other impact, really. I mean, it's just caused us to hunker down, to look inwards, to be more afraid of the outside world, to be content in our own little neighbourhood. How long that will take to change after we've all been vaccinated, or as many of us as don't believe that that this is going to enable us to be manipulated by the Australian government or creatures from another planet. That'll take time. But I don't think that sort of apprehension about the outside world will go quickly. I mean, the sort of that great sweep of globalizing incentives that we saw during the 90s and the earliest part of this century does seem to be over. And you can see it not just in trade flows, but also in the attitudes picked up in polling of countries around the world, in their suspicions of others.
And it really speaks to that tension, doesn't it, between the priorities we place on the domestic versus the external, and how we actually manage that interplay between them. There is a question that potentially picks up a little more on that, actually, that's come through from Rod, and he's asking where you would rate climate change and pandemics in the list of foreign policy and national security issues, and should we be giving these issues greater priority in our multilateral and bilateral policies than, say, the issues relating to China and the US, or the more traditional IR issues?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it's it's a very important one. The way I sort of think about the world when I'm when I'm at my most reflective, I guess, is that the international order is run by many things. The economy is important. Economy is what gives states power. Power is what enables states to act in the world. But underneath it all, the thing you can do nothing about is the natural system. When the natural system changes, that's it. You adjust to it, and even if you can play around the edges. So I think the combination at the moment of the COVID pandemic and climate change, particularly the sort of alarming new report from the Intergovernmental panel, is a reminder that there are much longer term trends at work, and we would be very well advised to think more deeply about them. I don't mean just about dealing with COVID, but about the way in which we respond to all pandemic diseases, and what happens when the next one comes along. So so yes, we should be doing much more. I think climate change, energy policy has been a conspicuous failure of Australian politics over the past 15 years, and it's another example of when you are constrained by domestic politics, you are less able to shape the international outcome than you would otherwise be.
And speaks to the challenge of integrating our policy, across multiple domains.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Back to you, Bryce.
Very good. Thank you, Caitlin. You mentioned very briefly, or you compared Australia with Canada then. There's a question here that's potentially quite relevant, and it relates to Australia's size as a factor in its foreign policy. In fact, there are a couple of questions. The first one is from Jai Jackson Jin, who asks, have we always been, and will we always be, a middle power? Term that comes up quite often in discussions of Australian foreign policy, and what does this mean practically in your perspective? The second question is from Dr. Matthew Durbin, and it's quite confronting. He asks, fear of abandonment or fear of missing out? I find it difficult to credit that northern powers, China, I guess, have serious territorial interests in Australia other than security of supply. Is our conceit more about fear of small power irrelevance?
That's a really good question, and I think there's an element of that in it all. It has been a feature of Australian foreign policy over the years, as I wrote somewhere in the book, that we want to sort of stand here on this continent, jumping up and down and waving our arms around and saying, "Don't forget us! Don't forget us! We're here! We're here!" And it's certainly true that there's never been, an international organisation that Australia wasn't anxious to join if we could, or that we didn't want to construct if there wasn't one there for us to join already. So I take that point. I think that that's the other side of fear of abandonment, and there's a strong element of that in it. And I've now forgotten what the first part of the question was. Sorry.
The question about middle power, how do you define the term? Is that what we are? Yeah.
Well, we're always going to be a middle power, but we're likely to be a smaller middle power than we have been. It's very hard to imagine that in 30, 40 years time, Australia won't have become relatively smaller as the countries around us, like Indonesia and countries of Southeast Asia and so on, get relatively larger. When I was a diplomat in the early 1990s, we used to say to any visiting Europeans or Americans, you may not realise this, but the Australian economy is the size of all the ASEAN countries put together. That's a long time since we were able to say that, and the trend is probably to make us less relevant, less important, and so we are going to have to work harder to maintain influence in the world. And the question is how you do that. The AUKUS route, if you like, is to become more and more relevant to one of the major major powers, but there are other approaches you can adopt as well.
So just to pick up on that theme, actually, Allan, Tim Watkin asks, you conclude in the book, and we've talked a little bit about this, but this is a good question. You conclude in the book about the need for a new narrative and framing for Australian foreign policy beyond the fear of abandonment. What does that look like? Where do we need to look if we are to derive and create this new vision and framing?
You need to look elsewhere than me, I think. Caitlin is the answer, and I think I don't mean that sort of flippantly, but I do mean it for the reasons we were giving before. I mean, I've been around for a long time now. I've had experience. Those experiences have shaped me in certain directions and have made me value something as rather than other things. So I think, for new thinking, you don't go to someone like me. You go to lots of the other people on this webinar. But what they're going to come up with, I don't know. I am instinctively in favour of engagement. I think Australia has a lot of things to offer to the world. I really think that this country is a model in lots of ways to big countries as well as to small countries. But how we make the most of that, is the challenge for the next generation. I get irritated with people who, and you hear it a lot, to say, why can't it be like the early 90s again? The early 90s were wonderful. I was around in the early 90s. I love them, but they're not available to us anymore, sadly. And so Australia has to do different things in the world from things that it was possible to do then. So no, something new is coming, and I say to every time I talk to groups of new people joining the Australian Public Service, this is your job is much more difficult than anything that I ever had to contend with, because the world is so much more complicated. So you better get thinking.
Right, creative hats on.
Sorry, Caitlin.
No, that's okay.
No, I mean, there are a couple of questions here where it would be remiss of me as the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs not to ask. But before I do that, I think we'll try and close out on those. Are there any in the Q&A that you want to go for, Caitlin?
No, I'm going to hand back to you, Bryce, but can I say thanks to everyone? Fantastic questions coming through. Okay, good. We'll first then go to Thomas, and it kind of follows on from the last point. Thomas says, you alluded to a perception that it's hard to get the broader Australian public to care about foreign policy and engagement in our region, which of course is our raison d'etre. If speaking French is still allowed in Australia. Thomas asks, how would you suggest overcoming the indifference or lack of awareness? He once heard Hugh White mention that we should fund 10,000 young Australians per year to spend time in Indonesia to learn the language and build people-to-people links. What sort of ideas would you have to solve this problem?
Well, I think, I don't know that any government's going to be in a position to hand over that sort of money, but the new Colombo plan is a good example of the way in which that can be done. I think encouraging travel is really good. Two-way travel, encouraging language learning. I mean, this has been a perennial issue for us in Australia. But although it's been a perennial issue, we haven't learned to deal with it any better. Intern exchanges between groups. But of all the people I know, I think, maybe not all, but nearly, but a lot of the people that I know who have had really important careers in Australia dealing with Asia had their first experience of it somehow as a young kid, as an exchange student, or as someone going traveling through the regions. So anything Australian governments can do to facilitate that would be a good thing, but we do have to wait until the current pandemic is over before we can even contemplate what that might be.
Yes, indeed. And they can also be interns at the Australian Institute of International Affairs as well. One further question then from Caroline Irving. Do you have any suggestions for how to elevate the voice and influence of diplomacy and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade within Australia, and particularly within or with the defence and security establishment? Do you have optimism or pessimism about the situation changing?
I have pessimism about the situation changing. And the reason I say that is that in an earlier life, when I was the executive director of the Lowy Institute, right at the beginning of Lowy, we set up a blue ribbon panel looking at the instruments of Australian foreign policy to try to shame Australian governments into realising that Australia was terribly underdone overseas in our diplomatic representation and needed a lot more money spent on this. We had universal agreement that this was a good idea. The panel consisted of prominent business people and others. Everyone agreed with it. We hear, I've heard, you've no doubt heard, comments from senior military figures saying that the contribution of Australian diplomacy is important or underdone, and it does make a blind bit of a difference. So, look, I assume the reason for that is that that there are not many votes in any of this. You can't sort of build car parks or anything that would help you in various electorates. It's just money which goes into sort of a central Canberra department. Well, so I don't know. The DFAT has a new secretary, and that new secretary is someone who is well versed in the sort of details of the public service. So maybe she'll be more successful than others have been at fighting for part of it. But the overwhelming view of politicians, tends to be that diplomats are people swanning around the world, having cocktail parties and living in big houses, and this is, as we know, grossly unfair. There are a whole lot of Australian diplomats overseas at the moment living under very, very difficult conditions, but nothing changes. So I'm sorry. I'd love to be optimistic, but someone has to start working on the political leadership.
Okay, well, let's lay down that challenge then as a piece of optimism, perhaps, and invite our representatives to put more of a stake in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Well, that's all the time that we have for this session. It's been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed myself. Caitlin, thanks so much for your work, both in fleshing out Allan's book and helping me with the Q&A.
A pleasure. Thanks, Bryce.
And of course, thank you, Allan. I mean, not only for your work here in the webinar, your work with the Institute, but also your work on this book, which I'm sure will be the mainstay of work on Australian foreign policy for many years to come. And thank you to our audience, both those of you who are members of the AIIA and who are not. If you're not a member, make sure you become one. You can go to internationalaffairs.org.au and click on join or members. I think it is on the left-hand side. You can also take a look at our upcoming events. We have a very lively schedule, but for now, I'll bid you adieu and goodbye.